So the government of Bangladesh just collapsed. Yes, hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast. I just made a video detailing the troubles that Bangladesh is facing economically, socially, and politically towards the end of July, which I then posted on the 3rd of August. And then lo and behold, 2 days later, just after I posted the video, the entire government of Bangladesh collapses, with tens of thousands of protesters storming the capital. Even at the time that I posted that video, there were many people in the comments that were telling me, oh, that I don't have the complete story. Oh, more is happening. You don't understand. So much more is happening. And so, yes, the past week has been absolute chaos, and it's left a lot of people wondering just how exactly did things get this bad? After all, in the video that I made before, I said that, hey, things are winding down. A number of you in the comments specifically called me out on that, but here's the thing. I made that video back on July 27th, 2024, and it was sent off to my editor, and it did not get back to me until August 3rd when I posted it. In the time that I was making that video, things actually had calmed down quite a bit, and then they went all to crap afterwards. This, in turn, brings up the question that many of you probably have: what exactly happened in the span of just a week that completely collapsed the government of Bangladesh, and what is going to be happening next? For context, in case you've not seen my previous video, though you definitely should, here's the TLDR. Everything about this stems from the 2024 Bangladesh quota reform movement, something that is an anti-government and pro-democracy protest in Bangladesh that has been spearheaded primarily by university students. Initially, rather than bringing down the government, these protests were focused on restructuring the discriminatory traditional quota-based systems for government job recruitment that the government utilizes in order to stack loyalists into its positions. However, while that is how things initially started, the movement would expand against what people saw as an authoritarian government when hundreds of protesters and civilians, most of whom were just students, were killed by the government and police and army. That is not to even mention the paramilitary organizations that were affiliated with the government that have been effectively utilized as thugs. The majority of fatalities were caused by gunshots fired by the police and other government forces using lethal and deadly weapons against unarmed protesters and non-protesting civilians, which included many children and pedestrians. As for the timeline, things had kicked off back in June of 2024 in response to the Supreme Court of Bangladesh reinstating a 30% quota for descendants of freedom fighters, these being the people who had helped Bangladesh to liberate itself from Pakistan back in the 1970s. This reversed a government decision that had been made in response to protests back in 2018 when students had sought reform at that time and had actually gotten it. Again, if you want to know the context of all that, go back and watch my video. It explains everything in explicit detail about how it all works. Anyway, protests break out, the government seeks to suppress the protests by shutting down all educational institutions, and from that, they deployed their own student wing, the Chhatra League, along with other factions of the Awami League Party, such as the Jubo League, and others who resort to using firearms and sharp weapons against the demonstrators. The government would also deploy police, border guards, the military, and they would declare a nationwide shoot-on-sight curfew amidst a nationwide internet and mobile connection blackout that effectively isolated Bangladesh from the rest of the world. In addition to that, the government would block social media such as Facebook, TikTok, and WhatsApp, not allowing any protesters to be able to organize utilizing these apps. No one could get access. By August 2nd, there had been at least 215 deaths, with more than 20,000 people injured, along with thousands upon thousands of people being arrested across various parts of the country. Of course, when we talk about this, determining the exact number of deaths has been extremely difficult, because the government reportedly restricted hospitals from actually sharing information with the media without police permission, because things again got very violent, and anything that came out made them look bad. Hospital CCTV footage was confiscated, and numerous individuals with gunshot wounds were just buried without ever actually being identified. That is where things had been crazy, and that is kind of where I left things off back on July 27th. That is when things began to actually calm down. To explain that, about a week prior on the 21st of July, the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court finally reduced the percentage of quotas for government jobs from 56% down to 7%, which would be seen as a massive win for the students. But after all of the violence that had taken place, students were not yet ready to step down. Following the verdict on July 22nd, the anti-discrimination students movement would announce a 2-day suspension of protests. They demanded that the government lift the curfew, restore internet access, and cease targeting student protesters. Others would continue, but one of the main key organizers behind everything here would actually stop their protests. No further violence was really reported during this period. Things had actually calmed down. The organization would later further extend the suspension, but Even if there wasn't as much violence, law enforcement continued to mass arrest people. This would piss off quite a number of students. Moving on from this, on the 24th of July, broadband internet services were finally restored, and on the 28th of July, mobile internet was fully restored in Bangladesh, although I say that, social media websites like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok continued to be blocked because they didn't want to take any risks. Still, that was a huge step from where things were only a week prior. That being said, I mentioned this in my previous video, but on the 26th of July, police had detained 3 coordinators of the anti-discrimination students movement from the hospital. These being Abu Bakr Mazmundar, Asif Mahmood, and Nahid Islam. When these organizers were seized, the Home Minister of Bangladesh would claim that the reason they were detained was for their own safety, and also so that they could be investigated. After this, 2 more coordinators of the organization, Sarjis Ajam and Hasnat Abdullah, were also detained. This was really serious, and as for why the government would do this and potentially risk even more things happening, per officials, the reason that they were detained for interrogation was due to their alleged connection with the opposition. As you can probably expect from organizers and leaders being taken by the police, this is something that would only stir up conflict. The organization would threaten to resume their protest from the 29th of July if the 3 were not released, while also demanding action against ministers and police officers over the deaths of protesters. So literally a day or 2 after I made my previous video, things heated up again. As an example of how serious this is, if you look on the 28th of July, the day after I made everything, 6 protest coordinators from the anti-discrimination students movement, who had been taken into custody by the detective branch, went and issued a statement from the detective branch office announcing that the protests were being withdrawn. However, this caused some confusion because other coordinators of the same organization alleged that these individuals hadn't done this willingly, that they had been coerced by the detective branch in order to make those statements to stop the protests. The remaining coordinators would in turn vow to continue the protest with or without the support of those individuals. No one really knew what was happening. Meanwhile, as all this is happening, the government is relaxing the curfew restrictions day by day, which in turn allows banks, offices, factories, and things to gradually open once again to the public. And this is where I had thought that things were beginning to return to normal, but no, the government did not back down, and neither did the students. That, my friends, brings us fully back to July 29th, when everything kicked back off again. Protesters would resume large-scale demonstrations across various regions of the country after the government would ignore the ultimatum to release their leaders. As violence escalated across the country, police would arrest over 2,800 students in the capital of Dhaka alone. Meanwhile, as all of this is happening, it is not just the students who are protesting anymore. University professors across Bangladesh began to call for an end to student harassment as well as mass arrests. In a rally that was held at Dhaka University on July 29th, 2024, teachers would hold a moment of silence for students that had been killed in what would end up being labeled as the July Massacre. Which, again, I haven't gone into details on that in this video. If you want to hear the details about all the death and everything that happened here to lead up to these events, go check out my previous one. But as all of this is happening, a cabinet meeting that is chaired by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina would go and declare that nationwide mourning was going to be observed on the 30th of July to honor those killed during the quota reform movement. Of course, the majority of people would completely reject this official mourning as nothing more than a farce. They would subsequently declare that they were only going to mourn when justice was served for the students who had died in the protests. And so it was then that instead of mourning, what would end up happening on the 30th of July is that a number of prominent citizens would issue a 24-hour ultimatum for the unconditional release of the 6 coordinators of the anti-discrimination student movement. These being the ones that I mentioned were in the custody of the detective branch. In a press conference at Doc Reporter Unity, the executive director of Transparency International Bangladesh would say that if the coordinators of the quota reform movement were not released unconditionally within the next 24 hours, that they would carry out a human chain-like program. A total of 11 demands were presented in the press conference, and raising that demand, they said that those involved in the murder, regardless of their position or political identity, should be given the maximum punishment possible. They would go on to say that there should be a proper and transparent investigation and proper trial against those who had shot people during the quota reform movement. And they demanded independent, credible investigations under the United Nations into each killing and the use of weapons and force by law enforcement agencies. At this point, they wanted the UN in, they were not going to trust their own government. There was also a demand of the immediate release of arrested students, as well as stopping further arrests and opening of all educational institutions. However, these demands were not met, as you can probably imagine. So, the next day, on the 31st of July, the anti-discrimination student movement would organize a nationwide protest called the March for Justice. This protest was scheduled to take place at noon across courts, across campuses, and streets all over the nation. And it is from these protests that a number of students would be detained by police in varying different sit-ins. As an example of one of the actions that took place, from 12:20 to 1 p.m., University of Rajshahi students would block the Dhaka-Rajshahi highway as part of the protest. Police would end up detaining 5 students from the university over the course of the demonstration. What is interesting to note about this, though, is that even at the time that the police were still cracking down, some things actually did open up again. At 3 p.m., after being shut down for 13 days, Facebook, WhatsApp, and other social media platforms were reopened. But instead of reopening things more, besides that, the government would crack down harder despite the fact that social media was now open again. On August 1st, the government would go and ban the Jamaat-e-Islami Party, this being the Islamic Party of Bangladesh, along with its student wing and other associate bodies, as militant and terrorist organizations. As for why that happened, Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and her political partners largely blamed Jamaat-e-Islami, along with its Islami Chhatra Sibir student wing and other associate bodies, for inciting violence over the course of the protests. In an official circular, Bangladesh's Ministry of Home Affairs would say that the ban was imposed under its anti-terrorism law. In response, the chief of Jamaat-e-Islami would reject the decision in a statement, calling it anti-constitutional, and deny that it was ever behind any of the recent violence, saying, and I quote, "The government carried out massacres by party cadres and state law and order forces in the country to suppress the non-political movement of the students. The country's teachers, cultural personalities, journalists, and people of different professions are protesting against this genocide of the government." End quote. And this was not the only PR loss that the government would face. After this, there would be a candle lighting program that was organized in Naryaganj city to commemorate the victims of the anti-discrimination student movement across the country. This, though, was halted due to police obstruction. Students and parents would tell reporters that hundreds of them merely stood peacefully with candles in their hand. The police would in turn stop the program before it could truly begin, as they would begin lathi charging ordinary students with their lathi batons. At least 10 students at this time were reported as being injured. That is not a good look. It was pretty bad. But at least at this time, the police did go and release 6 student leaders. The government at this point was looking to calm tensions and forestall fresh demonstrations. Upon being released from the detective branch office, however, several of the coordinators would announce that, hey, no, we're going to continue the movement, and they shared their statements on social media. These were the 6 coordinators that I previously mentioned had been detained by the detective branch, and they said that they were coerced into issuing a retraction of their support for the movement, alleging that the statement was obtained under duress for the purpose of making a national broadcast. The thing that everyone feared had happened. As a result, the release did not actually alleviate public anger. Instead, it led to renewed protests. Demonstrators demanded the reopening of schools and universities across the country, and in addition to that, called for Sheikh Hasina to just resign, to remove her from power completely. Clashes would occur as police would fire rubber bullets into crowds, along with tear gas, and apparently there was even sounds of grenades going off. Due to renewed unrests and increased violence once again, internet service providers were once again restricted. Access to Facebook, WhatsApp, and Telegram were all shut down. For most of these, though, they were only restricted for about 5 hours. Access to Facebook and Messenger were reopened, whereas Telegram would remain completely restricted. That, in turn, my friends, brings us to the next day, August 3rd, the day that I posted my original video. As a last resort to quell the protest, Sheikh Hasina proposed peaceful talk with the protesters, stating that her office was open and she expressed a desire to sit with quota protesters and listen to them. However, by this point, there had simply been too much violence, and the central coordinator, Nahid Islam, would announce that the protesters had no plans to negotiate with the government any longer. He added that they had endured torture while in police custody and had resorted to hunger strikes while being detained by police and the detective branch. According to another one of the coordinators, Asif Mahmood, there is, quote, no dialogue with bullets and terrorism. And this violence, my friends, was only going to get worse. During an anti-discrimination student movement in Sylhet, clashes would occur between the police and students, along with the public. Initial reports would indicate that over 100 people were injured in this conflict. At another event at around 1:30 p.m. in Camilla, leaders and activists of the Chhatra League, the Jubo League, and others attacked a mass rally of anti-discrimination student movement protesters. During this attack, they fired openly at the students, resulting in 10 students being shot, with a total of 30 people being injured. In another place, in Bagra, there were reported clashes between protesting students and the police. These clashes would go from 4 p.m. to around 6 p.m., and during the 2 hours of the conflict, the police would fire tear gas shells, sound grenades, rubber bullets, and even shotgun rounds. The clashes became so fierce that several areas around the city effectively turned into just a complete war zone. At least 6 students were shot at this time, with an additional 50 having been injured. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record when I say this, but the next day, August 4th, would be even worse. And I mean that. On Sunday, August 4th, at least 91 people were killed and hundreds injured in clashes as police fired tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse tens of thousands of protesters calling for Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to resign. The death toll, which includes at least 13 policemen, was the highest for a single day from any protest in Bangladesh in its recent history, surpassing the 67 deaths that had been reported back on July 19th. The crackdown, though, did nothing to deter protesters, as demonstrators would continue to block major highways over the course of Sunday. The idea being to completely choke the nation and force a resignation of its leadership. In response to this, Sheikh Hasina would say after a national security meeting panel that, quote, "Those who are carrying out violence are not students, but terrorists who are out to destabilize the nation." She would say, quote, "I appeal to our countrymen to suppress these terrorists with a strong hand." From this call to action, violence would only escalate. Police stations and ruling party offices would be targeted. According to police, 13 policemen were beaten to death in the northwestern district of Sirajganj. In addition to those, multiple lawmakers' homes were set on fire. Across the capital Dhaka, at least 11 people, including 2 students and a ruling party leader, were killed, along with dozens more injured amidst more clashes. Hospitals were vandalized in this time, and at least 4 garment factories would be set on fire in Ashulia, this being on the outskirts of Dhaka. Now, the statement that I previously gave here came from the police forces within Bangladesh, and police forces have shot tear gas and claim that they have only fired rubber bullets at protesters, though some people have been injured and killed by actual bullets. The source of these has not really been confirmed, but the action and use of them has only served to anger people further. The renewed demonstrations would then lead the government to shut down the internet fully again and declare an indefinite nationwide curfew starting from 6 p.m. It is here at this time that Hasina would criticize the protesting students, calling them terrorists who were trying to sabotage the country. And this would be the final straw, with the one who ends up fleeing in terror being Hasina herself. Yes, my friends, I'm sure that many people would have already seen the news or had seen in the comment section of my previous video, but Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina would resign and flee the country on Monday, August 5th to India. And when this happened, things got crazy fast. Absolutely ecstatic crowds would end up storming unopposed into the opulent grounds of the presidential palace. And when they did this, they would carry out all different kinds of looted furniture and TVs. I mean, I'm telling you this right now. If you go and look at the videos of this, and I'm sure that we'll get some footage of some of the stuff going up here now, but there are some crazy scenes, like with people just walking out with chickens in their arms. One guy has a chair that is like made of red velvet balanced on his head. Another guy has his arms full of vases. Anything and everything that was not bolted to the ground, and perhaps even some of that, was stolen. Protesters would go through the office files, they would go into the private apartments of Sheikh Hasina. There was even people who sat on her bed and took selfies of themselves. It was, for all intents and purposes, a full-scale collapse. It was after all of this would happen that in a televised address to the nation, Chief of Army Staff General Waqar-uz-Zaman would announce the resignation and that an interim government was going to be formed following talks with major political parties other than the Awami League. They were not going to be a part of this now. Protesters would in turn celebrate, with victory marches being held all across the nation. Of course, some of this celebration became exceptionally violent. On that same day that Hasina resigned, protesters would set the Awami League's headquarters in Dhaka on fire, Houses and businesses of several Awami League leaders and activists were also attacked. Pretty much anyone and everyone that was affiliated with the government was now in the crosshairs. 2 pro-government television stations ended up being torched by demonstrators. The Jatiya Sangsad Bhavan, which houses the Parliament of Bangladesh, this was stormed by protesters who would take over 40 weapons from the building's security, though these would end up being later returned by students. The house of the Chief Justice of Bangladesh was vandalized. Over the course of the celebration and subsequent violence, at least 29 officials of the Awami League and associated groups, as well as their relatives, were killed. The specifics of which are simply far too numerous to list all of it here, but to give an idea of what has happened, and I know that I've already listed some of this, jails were attacked in Satkhira and Shipur districts, leading to hundreds of prisoners escaping. There was an Awami League leader in Satkhira who was hacked to death along with 4 associates after fatally shooting 3 members of a crowd that were trying to attack his residence. In another place, a violent mob would attack Baniachang police station in Habaganj, and they would set it on fire. The police would in turn retaliate and kill 6 of the rioters, and after the fighting, a total of 150 people, including police personnel, were wounded over the course of the incident. In another place, in Kushtia, police would open fire on rioters, which would end up killing 6 people and wounding more than 100. Along with this, 2 union council chairs were beaten to death by mobs in separate incidents in Khulna and Kanpur, and 5 people were killed in a clash between Awami League leaders and activists in Kishoreganj that also injured hundreds of people. And it's there that I'm going to stop, at least with listing all these varying things, because at that point it's going to be simply a repeat of everything else that I've already said, just with different places and names. What I have listed here is merely a fraction of what happened. But we have to move on to the resolution. On the 5th of August, the Chief of Army Staff, Waqar-uz-Zaman, would convene a meeting with representatives from the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the BNP, along with the Jatiya Party, or Shad, and the Jamaat-e-Islami. From there, they would call for the creation of an interim government within 48 hours, something that would exclude the Awami League. As for who was actually going to lead this new interim government, subsequent reports would indicate that it was going to be Muhammad Yunus, a Nobel laureate. He had been approached to be the head of the interim government with the support largely of students. In addition to that, Waqar-uz-Zaman would pledge an investigation by the military into preceding incidents of violence and issued an order prohibiting security forces from opening fire on crowds. Which, on that note, interestingly enough, on the 6th of August, the day after all this goes down, the Bangladeshi Police Service Association initiated their own strike, demanding for enhanced security measures for its members. This may sound odd. The association expressed regret for the role of the police force in the recent unrest and violence, and it stated that its officers were, quote, forced to fire. Like, yes, they were forced to fire upon the protest, and subsequently they were being portrayed simply as villains. The validity of this is, of course, questionable. In response to the absence of police, students and several paramilitary personnel were subsequently seen doing their varying different police duties, directing traffic, maintaining law and order, and pretty much anything else that police would have done. So yeah, that happened, and anyway, on August 6th, the president of Bangladesh would dissolve its parliament to make way for the new government and elections. President Mohammad Shahabuddin would also issue an order for the release of all students who had been detained over the course of the protests. Following a meeting with student leaders on the 6th of August, Shahabuddin would formally appoint Yunus on the 7th of August as the head of the interim government. Yunus was then inaugurated on the 8th of August following his arrival from Paris. This was a massive step for change within Bangladesh, but some other things would still happen at the same time. On the 7th of August, several officials from Bangladesh's bank would initiate a protest near the governor's office. The objective that they had at the time was to compel the resignation of certain high-ranking officials due to the fact that they were allegedly involved in corruption, something that, if you've seen when I talked about in the previous video, pervades large parts of Bangladesh. That same day, one of the bank's deputy governors would resign, along with 3 others expressing their intention to follow suit. Only 2 days later, on the 9th of August, the bank's governor, Abdur Rauf Talukder, he would resign from his position, citing personal reasons as being the reason why, not because of any alleged association with corruption. This was big, but in addition to banks, there would be another shakeup in the courts of Bangladesh. The Chief Justice of Bangladesh's top court would resign after an ultimatum from protesters on August 10th. This individual, Obaidul Hassan, he had been appointed to the helm of the Supreme Court only this last year and was seen as a stark loyalist to Hasina. He was told to step down on Saturday by protesters who gathered outside of the court in the capital of Dhaka. Students had decided to take to the streets when they had heard that there were reports that Hassan was holding a meeting with justices of the appellate division. Meetings between members of the Supreme Court could be seen as risky to the movement. Protesters saw this as a potential judicial coup in the making, and so they gathered at the Supreme Court and demanded that he immediately resign. As for why that is the case, we already talked about before about how Hassan was a Hasina loyalist. The students believe that the Supreme Court is highly politicized and want an additional 7 other members to also resign. Among these 7, 5 of them would agree to resign on August 10th. Of course, as all this is happening, supporters of the Awami League are not just going to sit back and do nothing and let all this happen. There have been counter-protests. Thousands of Awami League leaders, activists, and locals would gather to protest and block the Dhaka-Khulna highway. And there they would demand the return of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to the country on August 10th. Of course, that didn't happen, and the army would intervene and instruct the protesters to clear the road. The crowd, of course, would not step down and began to throw bricks at the army. After this, the army would then use batons to forcefully disperse the crowd. In response to this, protesters would vandalize an army vehicle and set it on fire. And that, my friends, brings us to now, I guess. The question now is whether or not the interim government can actually do something to help stabilize democracy and justice within the country. Something similar was actually attempted in the period between 2006 to 2008, but we've seen how that whole thing kind of played out. After the assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in 1975, would come the military rule of Ziaur Rahman in 1977, this being followed by Hussein Muhammad Ershad in 1983. There would be a democratic movement that would gain momentum, which would lead to mass protests in the 1990s and the restoration of parliamentary form of government. But that did not ever actually end the political unrest. The period between 1991 to 2008 would see frequent strikes and protests by the Awami League, Bangladesh's nationalist party, and other forces, which would lead to a state of emergency and intervention by the military during the crisis from 2006 to 2008. Initially, the deployment of the army to combat internal violence in Bangladesh did seem like it was a pretty promising solution to the escalating unrest. It would be something that could stop it. The move was actually met with public approval, seen as a decisive step towards restoring peace. However, the extensive role of the military in the caretaker government would lead to concerns about civil-military relations and the potential for future military intervention in politics. If you cannot really trust your civilian government and you cannot really trust your military, what exactly is it that you can do? The postponement of elections that were originally scheduled for January 2007 led to increased political tension and violence, undermining the caretaker government's credibility. There were a number of different cases of torture, of killings, of arbitrary arrests. High-profile anti-corruption drives would target prominent political figures, which were seen as politically motivated. Over the course of this recent Bangladeshi history, this normalization of violence would influence the next generation of party loyalists, who became socialized into a culture where utilizing violence, this was just something that was seen as an acceptable political tool, which is why, from everything that we've talked about, for those who are confused, why every single party seems to have a student wing that is ready to fight. The biggest challenge that the country of Bangladesh faces currently is that of employment and its economic situation. The current protests specifically started as a student movement demanding changes in the quota system as people were seeking stability of government jobs in a job market that is extremely unstable and simultaneously not all that beneficial for the average everyday citizen. Will the government actually be able to fix this? We don't really know. Their aim has to be to stabilize the economy, along with preparation for free, fair, and meaningful elections. That is really all that the government can try to do at this time. Whether or not any of it will succeed, well, time will tell. But the nations around Bangladesh, in particular India, are watching it quite carefully. My friends, this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast and a update to the situation in Bangladesh. I promised a week ago that we were going to be making this episode here. I promised that we would. And then I had multiple other videos that had to be created, on top of which more things were happening, and I wanted to wait to see and get confirmation of what was going to happen after the arrival of Yunus. But you can be sure that if there are any further changes, if there are any other analyses that need to be made about Bangladesh, that I most certainly will be talking about those. I could do an entire video easily on how the garment industry is something that both created and destroyed the country, but that is another video in and of itself. And I know that there's a lot of comments that say that I say that phrase a lot because, hey, guess what? When you talk about the history of everything, there's a lot of things to talk about in everything. Goodbye, my friends. Thank you all very much for watching. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all next time. If you want to check out my actual podcast episodes that I do, not just these videos, make sure to check out the actual History of Everything podcast, which is linked down in the comment section below. And if you want ad-free episodes of it, make sure to check out my Patreon, which is also linked down below. Thank you all, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, guys.